It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Sarah, a waitress at a local diner, was working her shift. The usual customers had already come and gone, the midday rush had passed, and she was beginning to feel the lull of the afternoon. She had been working at this diner for almost 2 years, and it had become second nature to her. The friendly regulars, the unassuming chatter, the rhythm of the clinking plates and cups. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and she found comfort in its predictability. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. That day, the diner was relatively empty, save for a few tables occupied by people enjoying their lunch breaks or solo diners reading newspapers. Sarah, always attentive but never intrusive, moved through the tables with the efficiency of someone who knew every corner of the place like the back of her hand. The kitchen hummed in the background, the cooks joking with each other as they prepared their dishes. It felt like just another day, and Sarah was happy enough to leave it at that. But when the door opened and a new customer walked in, she had no idea that everything was about to change. The man who entered wasn't exactly out of place in the small diner, but there was something about him that caught Sarah's attention. He was dressed casually, in a black t-shirt and jeans, his head shaved clean, and a scruffy beard covering his chin. He was tall, with an athletic build, and he carried an air of confidence that seemed to fill the room without saying a word. He had the kind of presence that immediately stood out. "Table for one?" he said in a deep, calm voice, glancing around as he entered. Sarah smiled warmly. "Sure, right this way," she said, motioning for him to follow her. She led him to a booth by the window, the one that overlooked the street where the cars and pedestrians passed by. He slid into the seat, and Sarah handed him a menu, ready to take his drink order. "Coffee," he said simply, his gaze already scanning the menu in front of him. "Got it," Sarah replied, jotting it down. She turned to walk away, but paused for a moment. Something about the man was nagging at her, but she couldn't quite place it. She had seen plenty of people walk into the diner before, but there was something oddly familiar about this one. She shrugged it off and headed toward the counter to grab his coffee. It wasn't until she brought the coffee over to his table and placed it in front of him that it hit her. He looked up from the menu, his intense eyes meeting hers, and it clicked. She had seen this face before, on a podcast, on TV, on the internet. The man in front of her was Joe Rogan, the famous comedian, podcaster, and UFC commentator. Her heart skipped a beat. She had always been a fan of his work, especially his podcast, which she listened to whenever she had the chance. She'd heard countless guests speak on his show about everything from philosophy to science to the meaning of life. She never imagined that one day she would be serving him a cup of coffee in her humble little diner. Sarah's mind raced for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. She wanted to speak, to mention that she admired his podcast, but she didn't want to be one of those fans who gushed over him. She was here to do her job, and it was clear that he was just looking for a peaceful lunch like any other person. "Here you go, coffee," Sarah said, setting the cup down carefully. "Thanks," Rogan said, offering her a brief smile. His voice was calm, but there was something about him that made her feel at ease, as if he was just a regular person, not the celebrity she had imagined him to be. Sarah took a deep breath, returning his smile. "I'll give you a few minutes to look over the menu. Let me know if you need anything." With that, she turned to walk back to the counter, but her mind couldn't help but linger on the fact that Joe Rogan was sitting in her diner. She quickly found herself caught in a moment of awe. He had such a unique presence, but he didn't seem like he was looking for attention. He was just another person, sitting in a booth, having lunch. Sarah focused on her work, though, trying to shake off the initial excitement. She had other tables to attend to, and she knew she couldn't let herself get distracted. But she kept sneaking glances at him from behind the counter, watching as he poured cream into his coffee and took a sip, absorbed in his thoughts. The whole thing felt surreal, and she could hardly believe she was standing there in a small diner, serving someone she had only seen through a screen. Not long after, Rogan called her over. She approached his table, trying her best to remain composed, despite the flurry of excitement in her chest. "Could I get a burger, please?" he asked, glancing up at her. "Sure, coming right up. Anything else?" Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "No, that'll be it for now, thanks," Rogan said with a friendly nod. "All right," she said, taking note of his order before turning to leave. As she walked back to the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of admiration and nervousness. What was it like to be someone like him, famous and influential, yet sitting alone in a diner trying to enjoy a simple meal? Sarah wondered if he ever felt the need for privacy, or if he welcomed the attention. She placed the order in with the kitchen staff and tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to Rogan, as if there was something she was missing. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when Sarah was delivering his burger, that the moment finally arrived. As she set the plate in front of him, Rogan glanced down at the check and then back up at Sarah with a knowing look. "By the way," he said, his voice low and casual, "there's a note for you." Confused, Sarah looked at the check and noticed that someone had written something on the back. At first, she thought it was just a tip or a reminder to herself. But when she read the note, her heart nearly stopped. "Thank you for always being kind to everyone, even when the world is harsh. You make the world a little better just by being you." Tears instantly welled up in Sarah's eyes. She hadn't expected this at all. A wave of emotions hit her as she read the words, their sincerity touching her deeply. It wasn't the kind of message you saw every day, especially not in a diner. For a moment, everything around her seemed to fade away, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She looked up at Joe Rogan, who was smiling softly, his eyes kind yet knowing, as though he had seen the effect his simple gesture had on her. Sarah could feel her emotions bubbling up, the tears threatening to spill over. She blinked quickly, trying to hold them back, but it was no use. The tears began to flow and she couldn't stop them. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice breaking as she tried to compose herself. Rogan chuckled softly, a little embarrassed by her reaction, but still warm and supportive. "You don't need to say anything," he said gently. "Just keep being you." For a moment, Sarah stood there in silence, overwhelmed by the kindness of the message. It was as if everything she had been through, the long shifts, the difficult days, the moments of self-doubt, had all been acknowledged in that simple note. It was as though someone had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that few people ever did. And it made her realize something she had long forgotten. She was making a difference, even in the smallest ways. As she wiped her tears away, she gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly, the words feeling both inadequate and profound all at once. "You're welcome," Rogan replied, his smile still warm. "You've got a good heart, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." Sarah nodded, still a little dazed by the exchange. As she walked back to the kitchen to finish her shift, she felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the kindness of that simple note stayed with her. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, extraordinary things could happen. And for Sarah, the diner would always be more than just a job. It was a place where lives intersected, where small acts of kindness could change the course of a day, and where sometimes you could make a connection that transcended the ordinary. As for Joe Rogan, he finished his meal and left the diner with a tip, a quiet word of encouragement, and a reminder that even the most famous people could still touch lives in the most unexpected ways. The days that followed that fateful encounter were anything but ordinary for Sarah. She found herself replaying the moment over and over in her mind, each time discovering new layers to the interaction. Joe Rogan, the man she had only known from podcasts and interviews, had unexpectedly stepped into her life and left a mark on her heart. But it wasn't just the note that lingered. It was the realization that sometimes small acts of kindness could ripple out and create profound change in someone's life. In the following days, Sarah found herself more attentive to the world around her. She began to see the nuances of human interaction with new clarity. She noticed the way customers smiled at each other, how they greeted her with warmth, even when they were having a rough day. She started to believe that she could make a difference, not just through her work, but through the energy she brought into the diner every single day. For Sarah, the diner had always been a place where she could hide behind the routine. She could serve coffee, deliver meals, and take orders with the assurance that nothing much would change. She liked the predictability. She could go through her days without having to think too deeply about what she was doing or why. But after that brief interaction with Rogan, her perspective began to shift. She started seeing herself as part of a larger web of human connection. Each small action a potential source of positivity, no matter how fleeting. She found herself reaching out to people more, greeting them with genuine warmth, asking how they were doing, taking the time to listen. It was easy for Sarah to get caught up in the routine of her job, to go through the motions and focus only on the tasks at hand. But Joe's simple, heartfelt note reminded her that every person who walked through the door had a story, a struggle, and a need to be seen. She didn't have to change the world in a grand way. She just needed to be present, to acknowledge people, and to show them kindness. The realization sparked a shift within Sarah that affected every part of her life. She found herself smiling at strangers on the street, starting conversations with people she hadn't before, and even being more open with her friends and family. It was as if she had awakened to the possibility of making a real, tangible difference simply by being herself. There were no grand gestures required, just the willingness to connect and engage with the people around her. Weeks passed, and while Sarah continued to have moments of reflection on her newfound purpose, life at the diner resumed its usual rhythm. The familiar faces came and went, the chatter and laughter filling the space as it always had. But something had changed. Sarah could sense it, not only in herself, but in the way people responded to her. She noticed the light in her customers' eyes, the warmth in their voices, and the way they seemed more inclined to make small talk with her. She knew that they weren't just interacting with a waitress. They were connecting with someone who saw them as more than just a customer or a stranger. One particularly busy afternoon, Sarah found herself rushing to keep up with orders. The diner was packed, and it felt as though there was never enough time to catch her breath. She was juggling 3 tables at once, refilling coffee mugs, delivering food, and trying to keep everyone happy. She had just returned from the kitchen with a plate of pancakes for a customer when her eyes caught sight of a familiar face sitting in the far corner. It was Joe Rogan again. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized he was back in the diner. She wasn't sure if it was fate or just a coincidence, but there he was, sitting alone in his usual spot by the window. The sight of him immediately brought back memories of that first interaction, and the warmth from that moment flooded back into her chest. She hadn't expected to see him again, and she certainly hadn't anticipated how much the note would affect her. But there he was, as calm and composed as ever, a cup of coffee resting in front of him as he flipped through a notebook. This time Sarah wasn't nervous. She had learned so much since their first meeting. She had grown in ways that felt deeply personal, like the shift in her perspective had opened her eyes to a greater sense of possibility. She was determined to approach this moment without the anxiety that had initially gripped her. After a few minutes of watching him, she made her way over to his table. Her steps were confident, and she smiled as she arrived. "Back again?" Sarah asked, her voice friendly but light. Joe looked up, his face breaking into a familiar smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice warm and easy. "It's just too good here to stay away." "I'm glad you like it," Sarah replied, feeling a surge of warmth at the thought that he genuinely enjoyed the diner. She paused for a moment, almost hesitant to continue, but then the words came out before she could stop them. "You know, your note really meant a lot to me. It was unexpected, but in the best way." Joe's eyes softened and he gave a slight nod. "I'm glad it had an impact," he said. "I think people sometimes forget how much small acts of kindness can matter. It's easy to think the world is too big to make a difference, but it's the little things that count." Sarah's heart swelled at his words. They resonated deeply with her, as if he had somehow read her mind, understood her new outlook on life without her even saying a word. She realized in that moment that the connection they had shared wasn't just about the note or the brief encounter. It was about understanding the power of kindness and how, in even the smallest of ways, it could change someone's day or their entire life. "Thank you," Sarah said again, her voice full of gratitude. "I think about it all the time, actually. It's been eye-opening." Joe smiled at her again, this time with a deeper understanding in his eyes. "Well, you're doing great. Keep it up." After a brief pause, Sarah asked, "Would you like to order something today?" He shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Nah, just here for the coffee today. But I'll be back. Can't resist your pancakes for long." Sarah laughed softly, the sound of her own laughter surprising her. "I'll make sure to save you a seat next time," she said playfully, feeling an unexpected ease in their conversation. "Deal," Joe said with a grin, his demeanor casual yet kind. "I'll see you soon, Sarah." As Sarah walked away, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just about serving Joe Rogan again. It was about how much she had grown since their first meeting, how much she had learned about herself and about the world. In that brief interaction, she realized that there were so many opportunities to spread kindness, to connect with others, and to find meaning in the simplest of moments. Sarah continued to serve coffee, deliver meals, and smile at customers, but now, she did it with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was present in each moment, cherishing the opportunity to make someone's day a little brighter. Her work had transformed from a means of earning a living into a way of contributing to the world, no matter how small that contribution seemed. As for Joe Rogan, he continued to stop by the diner every now and then. Sometimes he came alone with a book or notebook in hand, lost in his thoughts. Other times, he brought friends or guests from his podcast to join him. He always greeted Sarah with a warm smile, and their brief conversations became a highlight of her day. The kindness that Joe had shown her in that one fleeting encounter had ignited something in her, something that continued to burn brightly. It had reminded her that no matter where she was, no matter what job she had, she could make a difference. She could be the person who noticed others, who took the time to show kindness, and who believed in the power of human connection. She could be a force for good, not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet everyday moments that often went unnoticed. And as the weeks passed, Sarah realized that the world had a way of showing up when you least expected it, offering gifts of kindness, sometimes from the most unlikely sources. But in the end, those gifts were never truly random. They were opportunities to give, to connect, and to make the world a little bit brighter, one small act at a time. As the months rolled by, Sarah's life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm she had never anticipated. It wasn't about waiting for life to happen anymore. It was about being an active participant in every moment, engaging with the world in ways she had once taken for granted. Her interactions at the diner became a source of constant reflection, as each new person who walked through the door had a potential impact on her life. She had learned the value of seeing people, really seeing them, and it made a difference. One quiet Tuesday morning, when the diner was empty except for a few regulars nursing their morning coffee, Sarah found herself behind the counter, sorting through the day's orders. The bell above the door rang as a new customer stepped inside, the familiar sound pulling her out of her thoughts. This wasn't just any customer, it was someone who had been a part of the local scene for years, a face Sarah knew well but had never spoken to. He was a businessman, usually dressed in a crisp suit, always in a hurry, always on his phone. He was the type of customer who came in, grabbed a quick coffee to go, and left without a word. But today something was different. The man walked slowly toward the counter, his expression thoughtful, as if he had a lot on his mind. Sarah noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. He wasn't the usual business-minded person she had seen before. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, something unspoken that she could sense even from across the room. He stood for a moment looking at the menu without really seeing it, his hand resting on the counter as if he was unsure of what to order. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice gentle as she approached him. The man looked up, startled for a moment as if he hadn't noticed her standing there. His face softened when he saw her and he gave her a small, tentative smile. "Morning," he replied, his voice tinged with weariness. "Just coffee, please. Black." Sarah nodded, quickly preparing the coffee, but something made her pause as she handed him the cup. She had been working in this diner for long enough to notice when people weren't okay. There was a heaviness in his posture that she couldn't ignore, a weariness that went beyond just needing a caffeine fix. He was someone who, in her eyes, seemed lost, carrying a weight far heavier than the cup in his hand. "There's something different about you today," Sarah said carefully, as she leaned against the counter, meeting his gaze. The man's eyes flickered, and for a split second Sarah thought he might brush her off, but then something shifted. He set the coffee down and sighed deeply. "It's been a rough couple of months," he said quietly, almost as if the words had been building up for far longer than he had anticipated. "My company's been struggling. My marriage is falling apart. I just feel like everything's slipping through my fingers, you know? And no matter what I do, it doesn't seem to get any better." Sarah listened attentively, her heart aching for the man she had barely spoken to before. He was a stranger in many ways, yet in that moment he was also just another person with a story, a person who needed to be heard. "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah said, her voice soft, not knowing what else to say. She wasn't an expert in business or relationships, but she understood pain, and she understood the need to be seen, even for a moment. The man looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thanks. I guess. I don't know why I'm telling you this. It just felt like I needed to talk to someone." Sarah smiled at him, a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. She had learned over time that sometimes all people needed was a brief acknowledgement, a kind word, a sympathetic ear, something to let them know they weren't invisible. "I'm glad you decided to talk," she said, her words lingering in the air. "Sometimes it just takes a little bit of letting it out." The man took a sip of his coffee, and for a moment they stood there in silence, a quiet understanding between them. It wasn't a magical solution to all his problems, but it was a moment of human connection, a moment that reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were still people out there who cared. "Thanks," he said again, his voice a little firmer now, a little more assured. "I needed that." "You're welcome," Sarah replied with a soft nod. "And if you ever need to talk again, you know where to find me." The man smiled, his shoulders seeming to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. He picked up his coffee, tipping his head in a gesture of gratitude before heading out the door. It was just another day in the diner, another brief encounter in the ebb and flow of people's lives. But for Sarah, it was another reminder of how simple moments, words of kindness, and even a brief conversation could have an impact. It wasn't about solving someone's problems. It was about reminding them that they weren't invisible, that they mattered. As the day went on, Sarah continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She took orders, served meals, and chatted with customers as if every interaction was an opportunity to connect, even if only for a moment. The world outside the diner may have been chaotic and unpredictable, but within the walls of the small diner, there was a constant. People came in, shared their stories, and left with a little bit of kindness tucked into their day. And that was enough for Sarah. Later that week, she found herself reflecting on the man's words. His struggles mirrored the stories she had heard from other customers, stories of loss, hardship, and frustration. She had always known that people carried burdens, but hearing them directly from someone's mouth made it more real. It was easy to look at a person's exterior and assume they had everything together. But deep down, everyone had their own battles, their own private struggles. The realization didn't come as a shock to Sarah. In fact, it felt like an affirmation of everything she had learned over the past months. She didn't need to be a therapist, a life coach, or an expert in any field. What she needed to do was simply show up, be present, and offer the kind of kindness that could help people feel seen, even for just a few minutes. And so she did. She smiled more, spoke to people with more warmth, and gave them her undivided attention when they needed it. Each small interaction became meaningful, and it didn't take long for Sarah to realize that this was her purpose, not just to serve food and coffee, but to serve people in a deeper, more meaningful way. It wasn't long before other customers began to notice the change in Sarah. People who had always come in with a rushed, business-like attitude now took a moment to slow down and chat. The regulars who once came in without much conversation began opening up, sharing their stories with her in a way they never had before. She wasn't doing anything special. She was simply listening, truly listening, and showing that she cared. The transformation was subtle but significant. The diner, once just a place of routine and familiarity, had become a community, one that was built on kindness and mutual respect. One afternoon, as Sarah was preparing a plate of fries for a regular customer, a familiar face walked through the door. It was Joe Rogan again. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought a guest with him, a woman Sarah didn't recognize. She wasn't sure if Joe had remembered their previous interactions, but as soon as he spotted Sarah, he gave her a wide grin and waved her over. "Hey, Sarah," Joe said, his voice casual yet warm. "This is my friend Jessica. She's visiting from out of town. Can you take care of us?" Sarah smiled back, feeling a sense of comfort in their interaction. "Of course. "It's good to see you again," she said, her voice as easy as ever. "What can I get you both today?" As she took their orders, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. There was a time when she would have been too shy to even say a word to someone like Joe Rogan. But now, she was more than just a waitress. She was someone who engaged with people, who made them feel welcome, and who understood the importance of every single interaction. As Sarah delivered their meals to the table, Joe looked up at her and gave her a knowing smile. "Looks like you found your rhythm, Sarah," he said. "I can see it in the way you interact with people. It's like you're doing more than just your job. You're making a difference." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude at his words. It wasn't about the validation, though it certainly felt good to hear. It was about knowing, deep down, that she was on the right path. She had found her purpose, and it wasn't tied to any one job or title. It was simply about showing up, being kind, and making connections with the people around her. As Sarah continued her journey of connecting with people, she found that the diner had become a place of unexpected revelations. Each day brought new stories, new faces, and with it, an ever-deepening sense of fulfillment. The realization that she could make a difference with something as simple as a smile or a word of encouragement felt like a quiet yet powerful force in her life. One evening, after the dinner rush had passed and the diner was beginning to empty, Sarah sat down at the counter, her legs aching from the day's work. She absent-mindedly wiped down the counter, lost in thought. The shift had been long, and her body was tired, but her mind was more energized than ever. The connection she had felt with her customers, the gratitude that had come from those small moments of kindness, it was all starting to sink in. She realized that while the job was demanding, it was exactly where she was meant to be. As Sarah sipped her water, her thoughts wandered to a conversation she had had earlier in the day. It was with a young woman, a first-time visitor to the diner. She had been quiet, reserved, but something in Sarah's intuition told her that this woman was carrying something heavy. Sarah, without hesitation, struck up a conversation, asking the woman if everything was all right. At first, the woman had brushed her off, but after a few minutes of gentle persistence, she began to open up. The woman, whose name was Emily, had recently lost her job and was struggling to find direction in her life. She was uncertain of what came next and felt the weight of that uncertainty bearing down on her. Sarah had listened, really listened, without trying to fix anything, simply offering a safe space for Emily to speak her truth. By the end of their conversation, the woman's shoulders seemed a little lighter, and she left the diner with a small but noticeable smile on her face. Sarah couldn't help but reflect on that moment. It wasn't just the satisfaction of helping someone through a difficult time. It was the awareness that, for the briefest of moments, she had been a part of that person's journey. The sense of connection was powerful. She didn't need to have all the answers. She simply needed to be there, present and open, and that was enough to make a difference. Later that evening, after the last customer had paid and the lights in the diner had dimmed, Sarah cleaned up the tables with a quiet sense of peace. As she swept the floor, she realized that her work had taken on new meaning. It wasn't just about the food or the service anymore. It was about something deeper, a shared human experience that transcended the ordinary interactions that had once filled her days. In that moment, Sarah understood that she had found her calling, not in the grand sense, but in the way she showed up for people every single day. It was in those small, often unnoticed interactions that she found her purpose. It was not about fame, accolades, or recognition. It was about the quiet impact she made in the lives of others, simply by being herself. As Sarah locked up the diner and stepped into the cool night air, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt truly connected to the world around her, and that was enough. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the waitress serving Joe Rogan in the story? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.